Hello, and welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast that explores how AI is changing media, journalism, and content creation. I'm Pete Paschal, longtime tech journalist and founder of the Media Copilot, and I'm excited to bring you fascinating conversations with fellow journalists, media executives, and the people building all the ways we'll create and consume news in the future. I'm thrilled this week to welcome Jeremy Kahn to the podcast. Jeremy is a journalist who's been covering AI for a long time, most recently for Fortune as the publication's AI editor. He's also an author. His book, Mastering AI, explores many facets of how AI is changing our world, from healthcare to the military to, yes, the media. What I like about Jeremy's perspective is that he has a very balanced view. He always carefully weighs the benefits of using AI versus the risks. He also has a really good sense of what disciplined use of AI looks like, something I think journalists can really benefit from. Jeremy and I had a wide-ranging conversation. We talked about copyright, bias, journalist co-pilots, and what the future of media looks like in a world where chatbots are summarizing everything. Be sure to listen to the end where he shares what frightens him the most about our AI-mediated future. And as always, if you do enjoy the conversation, I'd encourage you to share it with a friend or a colleague. And I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing to the Media Copilot newsletter if you haven't done that already. Links in the show notes. I'd also really appreciate it if you'd leave a rating or review in whatever podcast app you're in. Those really do help the show get in front of more people. Lastly, if you check out everything we offer, including media training classes for AI, for media marketing and PR professionals, you can go to mediacopilot.ai. Okay, here's my conversation with Jeremy Kahn, AI editor at Fortune and author of Mastering AI. Jeremy, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming. I'm excited to talk to you. Love the book.
Thank you.
Super ambitious. You're obviously looking at AI from a big perspective and a lot of different facets, and you thoroughly explore so many different things. But just, for listeners that I may have that may not have read the book,
Right.
Give me like the one paragraph synopsis of what it's about, what you set out to do, and really also like who you're trying to speak to.
Sure. So the book, which is called Mastering AI, A Survival Guide to Our Superpowered Future, is designed to be a kind of primer for a non-technical reader, so somebody who may not actually know that much about AI, to explain sort of how we got to this moment with this technology. How did we get to this moment where AI is seemingly everywhere and everyone's talking about it, and where it's poised to have such an impact on the way we work and societies. How did we come to this moment, and then what are those possible impacts? How should people think about how this technology may change everything from how we perform our jobs, how the economy functions, to our democracy and how that functions, to how even our own thinking works and our own social relationships. So it's a quite broad book, and it's designed to be a kind of primer for how to think about AI. It's not really a how-to guide about how specifically to do prompt engineering or which models one should use, but really how to think about the technology broadly and where we are likely heading and what some of, I think, are the wonderful possibilities that this technology opens up. And also, it's really a chance to warn people about what I think are some of the rather grave risks that the technology presents, and most importantly, grave risks that I think haven't gotten as much attention. So, it's still, even when I've been talking to people about the book, the thing that I get asked about the most is kind of existential risk. Isn't AI going to kill us all? Or the risk that we're all going to lose our jobs, neither of which I think are particularly realistic or risks that we should be very worried about. I don't think you should spend too much time worrying about that. But I do think there are risks here that we do need to worry about, and they are risks really about the overuse of this technology and the placement of AI systems into kind of places in human endeavors where they really don't belong. And they don't belong there because the book's kind of a plea to keep empathy and compassion at the center of a lot of these vital processes. And that's something that an AI model can basically never have because it has no lived experience, and so can never really have true empathy or compassion. And I think there are these dangers about overusing the technology and actually kind of losing some very important human qualities and traits and skills, and that is the real danger that this technology presents, and what we should try to guard against. And at the same time, we should not be so afraid of the technology that we lose out on what I think are some really great opportunities that it affords.
Yeah, totally. I get that. And I also, I found the book to be rather balanced, like you say, on terms of the potential versus the risks. But although because the risks are so dire, at least many people think they are. It must be very hard to sort of create that balance because it seems so weighted on that side in particular. So I want to dive into a bunch of that, particularly what you're sort of alluding to as sort of a more disciplined use of AI. But before I get to that, I'd love to just ask you: is there any? You're writing a book; it's a huge undertaking. You've got research, you got interviews, you got editing, and you're racing to a deadline. And then on with AI, it's this ever changing field. Like it's just like I feel like in the last 2 weeks, there's been huge announcements, right? So my biggest question, honestly, is like, what has changed since you wrote the book? What has really kind of surprised you in the last, however much time has been since the final manuscript went to the printers, and has any of those changes sort of changed your perspective?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, the book had to be kind of finalized in mid-April, essentially, and so that's quite a lot of time, particularly in AI. And as you say, this is a technology that's changing so rapidly. And I think if I ever had to write a book again, I would not pick a topic that's where that's changing so fast, because it made it very difficult to stay on top of everything. I think the good news is that I tried to project ahead quite a ways in the book. I was really trying to project sort of 5 years ahead, at least, in trying to get people to think about what some of the impacts would be. So in some ways, things haven't changed. And I think some of the things that have happened were very much on the roadmap or kind of on the trajectory. You could kind of see it in the cards even back in April. So hopefully the book kind of encompasses some of that. Things that have changed since then, I mean, obviously the models have gotten more powerful. I think this move to more agentic systems is happening a little sooner than I thought, although that's definitely something that I saw coming. But I thought, maybe it would be another year out. But it's actually, I think, happening this year, and it's definitely going to happen a lot more next year. I think that's changed. I think we've seen attempts to move forward with some regulation that have had met with various success. I think you've seen. I guess what surprised me. I guess I've been a little bit surprised by the way actually the energy footprint of this technology has grown so rapidly, and that people are now starting to talk about that a lot more. I do address that in the book, but now I wish I'd even spent, there's one chapter on that in the book, but I kind of, and it's one of the thinner chapters actually, and I kind of wish I'd spent more time on that in the book, because that's something where it's become a thing of real public salience much faster than I thought. You have people, the idea that you would restart a reactor at 3 Mile Island in order to supply Microsoft with its power for one of its giant data centers, which apparently is happening, is something I would not have predicted would have happened within the time scale of just a few months after I was writing. And the idea of building out these data centers at such scale with such huge power demands, and the way Google and Microsoft have both said they've kind of been thrown off their climate goals targets as because of technology. So I think that's something that I should have probably spent more time on the book, and something that's changed and been a little bit surprising to me. I guess the other thing is to watch what's happening at OpenAI a little bit, where there's not only have they raised this tremendous amount of money, but they are talking about going away from a structure where they're beholden to the nonprofit. And in some ways that's not surprising, because I always thought that was, and had written for Fortune and talk a little bit about in the book, how wasn't necessarily that sustainable a structure. On the other hand, I'm surprised to see them actually abandon it. I thought they would kind of muddle through in some other way, rather than essentially kind of rejigger the structure such that the for-profit arm is no longer beholden to the nonprofit. I thought they were going to continue something where they would essentially have the same structure, but it would be kind of corrupted by the fact that they had appointed people to the nonprofit board who really saw their mission as no different than the for-profit investors did. But that's not what's happened. So that's sort of interesting.
Yeah, definitely. One of the big things that's happened since you wrote the book is sort of, I think, the issue of copyright has flared up. Well, it flared up before because of the New York Times lawsuit and everything.
Yes.
But the deals that OpenAI has made in particular, and the attention now being paid to this issue by not just foundation model creators, but also just AI companies in general, like Perplexity. They have their partnership program. There's a whole bunch of startups that are really trying to build an economy around, content and being able to monetize it and build this bridge, I guess, between the content these engines need and the content creators. So What do you think of what's emerged since then? Do you see sort of an arc of where things are going? Because there's obviously sort of the legal stuff, like with New York Times and Getty, but also like there's a lot of activity with respect to like
Yeah,
figuring
there's
something out here.
right. I mean, and this is something I'm happy to say I got right in the book. I mean, when I talk about this issue, I say that, no matter what happens in the legal context, we are moving to a world of licensing. And that is exactly what's happened. And I laid out some reasons for that in the book. I said it was because, in part, it was getting harder to obtain public data because people were taking various steps to protect their data from scraping, which is what's part of what's happened. So it's gotten a lot harder for these companies to simply scrape data. But there's also the reputational risk, which I talk a little bit about in the book. People did not want to be seen to be stealing data essentially for free, and they were concerned about that. And the lawsuits, of course, there was a legal risk of the lawsuits. No matter how the courts ultimately go, a lot of these companies don't want to deal with having to contend with a lot of lawsuits. So if you can avoid that through licensing, that made sense. And I think the world was just heading that way. It was very clear that we were going to move into a world where you had to license the data you needed for training. And then, of course, the publishers are very interested in potentially striking these deals because they, as the publishing world has struggled with business models. And I think they see it as an additional revenue leg, potentially, and potentially a way to drive traffic back to the sites if there could be the right kind of linkages and things from the answers that a generative AI chatbot, provides, or a generative AI search engine provides, that there is potential to kind of send traffic back to the websites on which these publishers depend, back to the original content, and also this chance to sort of make money out of your archive and out of content you already have by creating these licensing deals for AI training. So I think those two things have combined. So you have seen a lot of activity around licensing, and I think that will continue no matter what. Whatever the courts decide. And I think actually with the courts, I still am of the opinion, but, I do think it can go either way. I talk to legal scholars who are, very erudite, very, very knowledgeable and experienced in copyright law who are on, either side of this issue. And, but I kind of came down marginally on the side that I think there's a chance the courts are going to say that the making of copies of this data for the purposes of AI training is a kind of fair use. They will create a kind of fair use exemption for AI training. But I think no court is going to be okay with plagiaristic outputs. So if your output, as we saw with the New York Times case, if you can prompt the model, and I don't, I don't think it matters how you do that. I mean, I know OpenAI thought that the New York Times, they contend the New York Times was kind of unfair in the way it prompted the model, but because they fed it exact, portions of a story and got it to essentially complete the story. But I think that doesn't matter. I think the court will say, look, if it's an exact copy output, that is a problem. That's a copyright violation. And that's still going to be an issue. So companies are going to have to deal with that either through some kind of filtering technology, or they're going to have to go back and license this content such that they have a right to do that anyway, to produce copies of it. I think that's how that may play out. But kind of irrespective of whatever the courts say on the issue of AI training, I think we're still going to be in this world where most data is going to have to be licensed for practical and kind of technical reasons, and also for reputational reasons.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because there's a few sort of gradations and distinctions in what you're talking about. There's sort of the AI training aspect of it, but there's also the sort of current news aspect of it, which is slightly different, even though there's
if you want the most up to date information, how is the chatbot or the LLM going to have access to that, and whose information are they going to draw from? Or if it's a search engine, people are probably searching for the most contemporary information, and they want trustworthy information. So you want sources that to be accurate. So all of that has pushed people to try to license kind of high quality data. I happen to think that there are some issues around some of the ways the licensing deals have been struck that are actually kind of worrying longer term. And maybe we can talk about that. But one of the issues I think is some of these deals have included the idea that not only is the tech vendor paying the publisher for the content, but as part of this, they've agreed to display the publisher's data more prominently in the response that the chatbot gives. And that all sounds good when it's being done, and it seems to be being done for a good purpose, which is, we want the user to have access to the most trustworthy, up-to-date sources, and we're striking these deals with trustworthy publishers. My problem is I think it sets this precedent of essentially paying for content placement. And
Yeah.
I really worry about what's going to happen with that because I think what will very quickly happen is that same model will kind of bleed into the world of advertising, and you'll have other brands. And at first, they'll be high quality, trusted brands. Of course, they'll be the Nikes of the world, and brands we all love, Disney or whoever it is, and they're going to pay OpenAI or Google to have the chatbot responses more prominently feature references to their products. And I'm worried about that, and especially if that's not completely transparent to the user that's taking place. I worry about a world in which you have these very persuasive chatbots and personal agents out there doing things for people, including shopping for them, where they might come back and return responses that are essentially shaped by advertising relationships that the tech vendor has with a third party that is not transparent to the user.
Yeah, I totally have definitely sort of my spider sense sort of has cropped up there too, particularly with some of the deals that OpenAI has sort of made, and Perplexity has sort of said they're going to not have whatever's going on with their publisher program affect the actual answers that they serve up, which seems to be the right stance. But again, the lack of transparency, I think, is a big issue, and also like something that you talk about pretty extensively in the book is this sort of idea of automation bias. So if you think about chat and these summaries being a part of how people just get information going forward, I think an AI summary, whoever's doing it, even more than like a search results page, is kind of giving you this illusion of objectivity, or this is the computer's version of it, and
Absolutely.
this must be true, right? And so
Absolutely.
I think that's going to be a factor in some of these things. And you think about how easy it is to make a chatbot on any site. You kind of get this idea of objectivity or whatever, this automation bias free as a bonus in doing it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. And I talk a bit about in the book the danger of automation bias in the context of kind of copilots that are being used in people's work. But I absolutely think it's also a problem when you talk about people using personal assistants or using chatbots kind of as a consumer product. Absolutely, there's a real concern there that people will just kind of take the pat response and not think too hard about it. It's one of the real risks, I think, of the technology is that we will give up our critical thinking skills. And I think even more so than already, we had this issue a little bit with Google. Just Google it, and whatever the top response from Google is, that's the answer. But at least with Google, there was this encouragement to actually click on the link, and by displaying the links, it was kind of as a UX thing. It kind of forces the user to think a little bit about the source of the information. But yeah, I don't think you have that really with these chatbot kind of capsule answers or generative search answers, even if they have kind of a footnote that says, here's the source. If you want to hover over that number, it'll tell you where to go, or it'll display a link. I don't know. I guess, I saw you wrote the other day about the fact that Google has this data that says lots of people, do click those things. I don't know. I think, right now there's not been very much independent research on this. And I really do worry that people will just take that as kind of the gospel answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The Google stuff, they had said that they seen good results before, like basically they had done an early version of AI overviews that didn't have many links, and they added more links, and surprise, surprise, people clicked on more links, which doesn't necessarily mean they click more than in traditional search,
Right.
which was sort of how I interpreted it initially. But it's becoming this whole new way people are getting information, though, and it seems to me everything you're talking about points to kind of a new frontier of SEO, and people competing for those summaries and being the things linked in them, and because it's a short list, right? It's not like a big page of Google.
No,
It's
absolutely.
like going to be a little more winner take all than
Yeah,
previous trend.
absolutely, even more than being in the top 10 links. It's like you got to be the top one or two.
Yeah, totally. So let's talk a little bit about AI and journalism itself, and
Sure.
what your perspective is. Obviously, you work at Fortune. You cover AI. But what is your been experience and your research? Like, I feel like from what people I talk to, and is that journalists are still fairly skeptical of AI in a lot of ways, which is sort of healthy because they're journalists. But in terms of actually using it in their work, what are you seeing in terms of emerging trends or tools, and how folks are just approaching it?
Yeah, I think it varies. We have some rules, as do a lot of places, about not putting sensitive information into public-facing chatbots. But I think there are tools that people are using, and we are using even some of the consumer chatbots in certain ways. So what I've seen people do is, the summarization ability of the technology is quite useful. So I've seen a lot of people, if you get a large document as a report or something that you're supposed to report, write about, I've seen people say, give it to an LLM, whether it's Anthropic or ChatGPT or perhaps Gemini, and say, can you summarize this for me? And then they might go through and double check that the summary is accurate, and it's not like you're putting that directly into your writing necessarily, but if you're trying to just digest a document quickly, I've seen people do that, and it's kind of a time saver. I've seen people use LLMs just to brainstorm questions to ask a source. So, I have an interview with this person. What would you ask them? Or to critique the questions they already came up with. Like the journalist comes up with questions. I've got 20 questions here, but what am I missing? What else would you ask? And I think that can sometimes be useful. It can be useful, particularly if you don't know the subject that super well, or whoever you're interviewing super well, come up with things. I've seen people, use it to try to parse big government data sets, which is more interesting, I think, in some ways. Some of the more power users are starting to use some of the, data processing and kind of coding capabilities of these systems to write a little script to pull this data out of a big CSV file that I just downloaded from whatever government agency it is, and actually start doing some analysis of it. And I think there's huge potential there to really give these kind of data journalism skills to journalists who wouldn't otherwise have those skills, because you can just do it in plain English. You don't need any coding ability. You don't necessarily need to know that much about how to deal with Excel or anything like that. So I think there's big potential there, and I've started to see some people do that. I've used it a little bit for creating form letters, things like when you have to write a FOIA request. That's a fairly formulaic letter, so it's pretty good at composing that, for you quickly, much faster than I could type it up. So that's useful. I use it for transcribing audio interviews all the time. I mean, and so does everybody I know. Everybody now uses some kind of AI transcription of their interviews. And then, you still have to go through, and very often you still have to go through and be very careful to actually listen to the quote you want to use to make sure it's been transcribed correctly. And I have seen a couple of people get this wrong, where the things that people have been misquoted, and they've said, look, I've been misquoted here. And someone will say, no, well, I have a recording, I have the transcript, but it turns out the transcript is just not quite right. So that when you actually go back and listen to the recording, it hasn't been transcribed accurately. So there are some dangers there. But yeah, I see people starting to use it that way. Sometimes, again, using it as kind of a coach for here, I've got this headline, and the human, writes the headline, but you want to know is it a good headline for SEO purposes or something, and you ask a chatbot to say, can you critique this headline for SEO? And you could automate that. And I've heard some news organizations talking about whether they could automate that process through some sort of an AI agent that would automatically write the SEO headline from the human generated one. But I haven't seen people actually implement that at scale yet, but perhaps that's starting to happen. I think there's lots of things like that. Perplexity and some of these other tools are pretty good for research. Again, you always have to check whether the summary is correct, but it's not a bad way of kind of getting quick answers to questions. I should say that, Fortune is one of those publishers that struck a deal with Perplexity. And so we kind of all have access to the pro version of Perplexity as part of that deal. And we've been using it for some basic research purposes. And there's some more specialized ones too for sort of academic research, if you use Consensus or Elicit to look at academic papers, and that can be quite good. So there's lots of sort of ways it's helping journalists, I think, get their job done a little bit faster and more efficiently. It's what most people are not using for, and I think it just isn't good enough for yet, is actually writing stories.
Right.
It's just not. Even basic news stories is not very good yet at doing that. And particularly, it's not very good at accurately quoting from something. So you give it doesn't seem, most of these AI models don't seem to really understand what a quote is. Actually, they understand the form of a quote, but they don't understand the quote has to be something actually taken verbatim from the source material. And so that seems to be a problem.
It does feel like, though, that use case, which is the most obvious one out of the gate when, ChatGPT came on the scene, oh, we could just get this to write stuff for us. And as much as there have been several problems and pitfalls and egregious stories about that, it seems like a use case that's not going away. Just
No,
because
you're
it is
right.
the most useful one, or sorry, not
Yeah.
obvious one,
Yeah.
but the most recent one story about this is ESPN. ESPN sort of announced a number of weeks ago now that they were going to start using AI generated stories to sort of service certain undercovered sports like lacrosse and whatnot. I'd like to get your perspective on that in terms of like as these models improve and as I guess we understand the processes better that you need to attach to that kind of use case. Um, do you think that is going to become something a little more common, or uh,
Yeah, no, so I think so, and I think you're already we're seeing this trend. Before I worked at Fortune, I worked at Bloomberg, and for years Bloomberg had this thing called
Sure,
Operation Cyborg, where they were trying to create a system that could write earnings releases,
yeah,
news stories from earnings releases automatically, and they got it to work pretty well. And that was even before kind of LLMs were a thing. That was based on a
mhm,
bunch of small machine learning models kind of strung together. And as long as you had a press release that was formatted in a fairly standardized way, as earning releases tended to be, it could extract the relevant information and write a simple pyramid structured news story. And I think, we already saw that a little bit with sports. I know that I think AP had also a project to write high school sports scores up that way, and that worked relatively well. So, yeah, I'm sure we're going to continue to see this with kind of LLMs at the heart of a system. But it has to be a system. I think that's what we're finding with all of these kind of Copilot technologies. You have to have it kind of configured as where the LLM is just one component that may sit at the heart of several different components, including other kinds of potentially AI models that kind of screen the content, make sure it's in the right format, make sure it's can even perform perhaps some basic accuracy checks. Is the information being presented actually present in the source material? So in order to get it to work well at scale. So, but I definitely think it's not going away, and people are definitely going to keep doing this. And also, the potential to create a better experience for the reader or the audience is pretty profound too. You could, again, if you're really into lacrosse, but ESPN can't afford to serve that niche audience particularly well, but now you can keep that audience on the ESPN site because now you can provide at least some coverage. That's a plus. Also, if you can customize video clips just for someone, as I think NBC did during the Olympics, or maybe I forget which network, but it was. I think that was quite useful. If you liked certain sports, you could select those sports and get a personalized highlight reel of clips, which again was a great experience, I think, for users that wasn't available before.
yeah, all impressive stuff. So you mentioned earlier that you probably the whole idea of AIs, replacing us and there's going to be a job apocalypse, likely won't happen for various reasons. But it's hard to sort of think about what we're saying here and all these tasks that, if you wanted to cover those sports before, you'd have to hire somebody. And, social media, that was a job, or SEO headlines, that was a job. It's hard not to think about everything we're saying and the implication being, well, these places are going to get a little leaner, right? And maybe that's not an apocalypse, but I do want to get your sort of nuanced view of what it means, not just for media, but for sort of work in general, knowledge work in particular, and also just the whole idea of as you sort of made away certain tasks that perhaps were more junior level. One of the things people are starting to worry about is sort of this pipeline problem, right? That how do you get senior level people if some of these more junior level tasks are now being done by machines? How do inexperienced people get good experience and sort of get their reps in? So I know that's a sort of a big topic, but AI and work, where's it going?
Yeah. So, it's a good question. I don't think there's going to be a job apocalypse where everyone loses their jobs and there's this huge technological structural unemployment where you just have a huge number of people who can't find jobs in any area because they've all gone away. I do not think that's going to happen. In fact, I think there's going to be a ton of new jobs created with this technology, as there always has been with other technologies before. That the lesson of technology is on a net basis, there's always been a gain in jobs. However, that does not mean that in any particular profession, people have not lost jobs, or that, in fact, whole categories of jobs have not gone away due to technology. So it is not, I'm not saying that every journalist is still going to have a job, or the journalistic organizations, if you were to look at them, 10 years hence, will have staff sizes the same size they have today. I'm just saying that those people who lose their jobs in the field or not, or can't enter it because there are fewer jobs to go around, there will be other things for those people to do in the world. But it may not be, yes, in the same profession or doing exactly the same thing. And I think all of our jobs are probably going to change in a lot of ways. And the things we're asked to do are going to change. I mean, one of the things this technology does is it makes it much more easy to kind of be multimedia and multimodal. That was already kind of a trend that we were seeing prior to the advent of AI, but I think AI accelerates it. So that's something that may change. So I think, some of the ways that there's going to be an increase in jobs will be in areas of knowledge work where there are real shortages. And I think journalism is kind of an area where there's some shortages in some areas, but we haven't quite figured out the business model right. But some other professional service areas, the business model is not the problem. The business model seems to work okay. The problem is there just are not enough people who want to go into those fields. And I'm thinking particularly about things like accounting, where there is a real crisis of we do not have enough trained accountants to service all the businesses out there that need accountants. And one way this problem could be solved is really through the use of AI Copilot. So you can take people who maybe have less experience and less formal education in the field, because to become a CPA right now, you have to have a 4-year degree, plus you have to do additional certification. But you could take people maybe with a 2-year associate's degree in bookkeeping, give them access to a Copilot, and allow them to take on some of the work that a more senior person and more experienced person would have to do today. And then you can, that essentially democratizes access to that professional service, allowing more businesses to have to avail themselves of an accountant, and potentially helps with public company auditing too, where there's a real crisis of people. So I think that's an area where you might see an expansion of work, and where you can actually kind of lift people back into the middle class who've been pushed out over the last several years, because there's been such a premium on people with higher levels of education and experience. Now, you asked the question about the pipeline and what happens to the pipeline in these professions. I do think, you are going to need, in professions that relied on huge cohorts of young associates kind of coming in, that you won't necessarily need such large numbers of junior people anymore. And then the question is, well, what happens to the people you do bring in? How do you train them, especially if these junior tasks are being automated away? I'd say two things to that. One is, it's not entirely clear always that the best use of this technology is the automation of these more rudimentary tasks. Sometimes I think actually people get that wrong, and the more powerful use cases actually are to kind of act as a kind of coaching mechanism, sometimes even for more experienced people, but certainly kind of serving the kind of role of the more experienced person as kind of a coach to the junior employee. But you sort of still need the employee maybe doing the work, but they're now doing the work with this kind of coach sitting on their shoulder, helping them along. That's, I think, sometimes a more powerful use of the technology than simply giving the technology a task that you would normally give a junior employee. But the other thing I would say is I think we're going to see a return to kind of classic apprenticeship, where you have a select number of junior people brought into an organization, maybe not a huge several hundred of them, but you bring in a dozen, and you assign them to actually work at the elbow of the senior person. So they're literally shadowing them all day, kind of as you used to see back in the 19th century in a field like law, and you used to see in some other fields as well. You literally had kind of clerks that sat in the same room at the shoulder of the more senior person. They kind of learned by osmosis, and the senior person would give them various lesser tasks to do, but that's the way the learning took place. It was not, necessarily through sending out a vast cohort of young people to actually perform tasks that were considered, beneath the senior person.
That all makes sense. I want to ask you about bias, because you spend a good chunk of the book on bias in AI systems, and that they often perpetuate and even amplify existing biases in training data. Like the example that always comes to mind is you ask for a picture. Depends on the system, of course, but if you ask for like a dark-skinned doctor treating a white-skinned child, it almost always gets it backwards, right? Because of that bias. But my question is, like, you mentioned in the book a lot of things sort of AI systems and AI designers can think about as they build these systems. But I want to know, as a user of AI, how do I mitigate bias, or what do I do beyond just sort of being aware of it? What is your advice?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and it's actually a hard question for I think for a lot of users because in some cases you may not be able to do that much. I mean, the issue of the system that can't produce a dark-skinned doctor treating white children is a problem with the data itself, and it's a problem on the data the system's been trained on. As a user, once you're given the software, there's not too much you can do. You can keep saying to it, "No, that's not right," but it'll
Right.
as that research showed, it'll keep getting it wrong. But at least being aware of that is probably a good thing, and thinking about am I depicting the world as it is and not as the system wants it to be seen, and am I fulfilling the diversity requirements that I'm required to fulfill as part of my work or whatever it is, or to be a good global citizen. I mean, just being aware of that, I think, is helpful, and thinking about it is helpful. You can prompt the system actually very explicitly to not be biased, and it actually seems to make some difference in some cases. Not always, but as I said, sometimes the data that the system has is so skewed one way that it simply cannot produce another output. But in other cases, it's possible to kind of push the system through prompting to produce a fairer output, and that's something one can be aware of. Also, I think there's fine tuning one can apply. If you think that the initial data set is badly skewed, you can try to fine tune on another data set that's either that's designed to kind of de-bias some of the initial training. And there's some research on this. It's not a foolproof method. It only partially works, but it is something that businesses could do. And you could train a system from scratch, of course, on data. You could also start using smaller models, which are easier to train on smaller data sets, which I think is what some businesses have come around to. Is that if they're very concerned about this bias issue, sometimes the answer is not to use an LLM, but to use a much smaller model that is trained on a very specific, highly curated data set that you can kind of control the parameters of. So I mean, those are some ideas, but I think it's really up to the companies creating the LLMs to think harder about bias than they have. They've tended to just throw everything in the kitchen sink at these systems to get them to work well, and haven't thought too hard about how you might curate the data set better.
Right. And they're also sort of such in a hurry to outpace each other. A lot of stuff just gets thrown out there without fully appreciating.
Yeah, and often it's just about, they'd rather just have a data set of size rather than caring too much about what's in it.
So before we wrap up here, I want to do a really quick speed round of the various big players in AI and get your really quick thoughts on each of them. So give me one or two sentences on each. You ready?
Okay.
All right, here we go. OpenAI.
OpenAI, I think they're doing great. They have the most potential out of this current crop to kind of break into that ultra elite realm of giant tech companies. If the wheels don't come off the whole thing, and that's the problem. They keep being, they're always on the verge of imploding, it seems like. But they also, I think have only kind of doubled down on their early lead in some ways, in the chance of kind of getting to that upper echelon of big tech companies.
And related, Microsoft.
So Microsoft has probably played this whole AI revolution better than anyone else so far, and I think they're continuing to position themselves very well for the future. In part because their business models are primarily based on subscriptions, which I think is a good thing because it more closely aligns kind of user desires and intentions with that of the technology vendor. I worry about other companies that really have an advertising-based model that you're always going to have this disconnect that's going to be problematic.
Amazon.
So Amazon has really struggled so far to get its feet under it on AI. But I think they're huge. You can't count them out. I'd say their relationship with Anthropic is very interesting, and I think they could yet come back, but they've been struggling so far.
Google.
So Google, also kind of out of the bat, people thought was going to get smashed by OpenAI, that ChatGPT was a Google killer. I think that stuff has proven not to be true. But Google still faces two big problems. One is this real innovator's dilemma, does the generative AI search stuff actually generate enough eyeballs on ads to maintain their revenue stream, that's still a big problem. To what extent are they cannibalizing their search product? And then the other big problem is the antitrust issues. Like if Google gets broken up, which it seems like now there is a very real possibility of potentially happening, that who knows what happens then. But that obviously that would seriously throw them off their game plan.
All right, two more. Meta.
Yeah, Meta's very interesting. They've taken this real stance on open source AI and have managed to emerge as the real leader in that kind of niche. And lots of people are building on Llama. It's proved incredibly popular with enterprise customers in particular, and they've got seemingly great access to talent. I think there's still this issue about, again, like what is the model here ultimately? Like, when will Meta want to continue to invest forever, essentially, in maintaining this open source ecosystem that it's helped create? I think that's the big question there. But so far, they've positioned themselves very well.
And Apple.
Yeah, so Apple, interestingly, I think also really struggled, did not have the right talent or the right kind of data center infrastructure to really be a player in LLMs, has tried to build these things on its own, hasn't really worked well, has had to strike this interesting partnership with OpenAI. But they may still emerge as a very significant player in the consumer-facing AI world simply because of their distribution base. I mean, the iPhone is this incredible distribution platform, and I think that will still be a strength going forward.
Nice. Cool. I just got one more question for you before we go. It's actually a two-part question, so I'm cheating. But thinking about, where we're at in AI and projecting forward a bit, what are you most excited about? And after you're done with that, what are you most scared about?
Sure. So I'm most excited about actually the potential for this technology really in healthcare. I just think we're going to see amazing stuff happen in the development of new treatments for diseases and in also the practice of medicine through this technology. And I think it's incredibly exciting. I mean, just today, we're talking on the day that they announced the Nobel Prize for Chemistry that went to Demis Hassabis of DeepMind and John Jumper, who led their protein folding team there. And I think that's an acknowledgement on the part of the Royal Academy of Sciences Sweden that, this is a really impactful technology on biology and biological research. And I think we're only at the very beginning of seeing how that plays out, and I think it's going to be very exciting. So that's what I'm most excited about. What I'm most concerned about or afraid of, I'm actually quite afraid of, I think, where we are right now a little bit with agency, where we might, just kind of give these systems a little bit too much power to do things for us. And I'm not concerned about like the big existential risk scenarios, but I'm kind of concerned about, you send the system out you give it some vague instruction, like go make me $10,000 in the next hour. And it goes out and, runs a phishing campaign for you. And then, you end up with the money in your bank account. And then you say, no, I didn't mean that. And well, who's liable then? And I think if we get enough people doing this, it's going to be chaos. So I'm a little bit afraid of that. And then I'm afraid of, as I said at the beginning, that we maybe overuse the technology, that we just become so dependent on it that we really give up a lot of our really important human critical faculties. And I think, we've seen with social media how seductive it is to just kind of be on your phone the whole time, scrolling through social media and through short form videos and, posting terrible things to one another. And I don't think anyone thinks that that's sort of improved the public discourse. And I'm quite concerned that kind of AI will, again, exacerbate that to some extent, where we're just going to be in conversation with our AI chatbots the whole time and ignoring one another.
Jeremy, this has been awesome. Seriously, I think I got through maybe half my questions. There's a whole bunch more. I'm going to have to talk to you again at some point, but this has been such a great conversation. Thanks so much for all your insights.
Pete, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Cool. The book is Mastering AI. I've got it right here, available wherever you can find books. Thanks for listening to my conversation with Jeremy Kahn. You can follow him at Jeremy A. Kahn, that's Kahn, on X. And if you like what you heard, please just take a minute to leave a rating or review for the Media Copilot in your podcast app. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Media Copilot newsletter and check out mediacopilot.ai for our classes on AI for journalists, PR professionals, and content creators. Be seeing you in the future.